We are live in 1 minute. Ten seconds. And we're live.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sandro Galea, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. On behalf of our school, welcome. Before we begin, a word of thanks to everybody who helped make today happen, in particular to Meredith Brown and Alicia Noel, and to our Office of Graduate Student Life, who worked to make it possible to get today's featured book into the hands of many of our incoming students. Thank you. And a thank you to all of you for joining us during these unusual and challenging times. Welcome to our Fall 2020 School of Public Health Signature Program Series. At these events, we come together as a community to engage with issues of consequence for public health. We are joined by speakers whose work intersects with these issues. As we begin the academic year in unprecedented times, it is more important than ever that we continue the conversations that shape a healthier world. Thank you to everybody for joining today's discussion. Today's event is part of a special series as part of our SPH Read series. It's a year-long program hosted by our Office of Diversity and Inclusion. The program aspires to stimulate dialogue around topics relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. It is guided by the leadership of Dean Yvette Cozier, our Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice. I am now really pleased to turn over the screen to her to introduce today's speaker, Ali Noorani, a graduate of the program and a friend, and his book, There Goes the Neighborhood. Yvette, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Galea. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Boston University School of Public Health Diversity and Inclusion Seminar Series. My name is Yvette Cozier. I'm an Associate Professor of Epidemiology and the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice at BU School of Public Health. We continue today our annual One School, One Book program, SPH Reads. This year's selection is There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration by Ali Noorani. In this book, Mr. Noorani interviewed nearly 60 local and national leaders across the nation and across the political spectrum in order to offer a new approach to politics, one that confronts problems and pushes all parties outside of their comfort zone in order to reach solutions. Especially now when we feel our identity, culture, and values changing shape, the collective message from all the diverse voices in this inspiring book is one of hope in the future. Ali Noorani is the son of immigrants from Pakistan and was born in California. He studied at the University of California, Berkeley before joining BU School of Public Health and earning an MPH. After graduation, Mr. Noorani went on to become the Director of Public Health for the Dorchester House Multi-Service Center and Codman Square Health Center. He also spent time working for the City of Boston, assisting with the city's regional environmental projects, and served as Executive Director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition. In 2008, Mr. Noorani took on his role as Executive Director at the National Immigration Forum and has used his platform to create, his platform to create real positive change. He frequently appears on news stations, university panels, and at conferences and in print, and has become a renowned voice on immigration policy and politics. Please join me in welcoming Ali Noorani. Thank you.
Hi there, everybody. So thank you so much for having me today, Dean Galea. I really appreciate the opportunity. Dean Kozier and everybody at BU School of Public Health who may have been there when I was there or are new to the school. I just really am grateful for the leadership of the school, the training and education that students get or provided at the school. But I think most of all, I am really grateful for all the amazing work that students continue to do, either while they're spending time in Boston or go on for their careers. So I really appreciate the opportunity and thank you. So I got a master's in public health, but I now work on immigration policy. It's a system of laws that impacts people of color around the world. In fact, currently there are about 258 million people, most of them are people of color, who are living in a country other than their own. And of those 258 million people, there are about 70 million people, again, most of them people of color, who have been forcibly displaced, who are living as refugees. So as a person of color, as a child of immigrants, as a graduate of Boston University School of Public Health, I work on an issue of great importance to myself personally, to our nation, to our world. And every single morning, I have to say, I wake up thinking that I am the dumb luckiest person ever to just play a very small role in this important topic and to be able to work with the people that I do at the National Immigration Forum. But most of my time at the National Immigration Forum, we spend working with folks who are not immigrants, who are not people of color. Because on this issue that dominates so much of our news and our politics, I want to know why people are afraid. I want to know what their fears are. I want to know what makes them afraid of immigrants and immigration. And I want to meet them where they are. But in the end of the day, I want to make sure that we're not going to leave them there. So let me tell you why. We do this work the way we do and what we're learning from it. So let me take you back to February of 2019. It was a late afternoon in that year of that month in 2019. I noticed an elderly woman sweeping the front of her house. She was singularly focused on her task. And as she was sweeping, there was a small cloud of dust that rose up. In her own way, she kind of reminded me of my own grandmother, making sure that her home was always presentable. And that she was always watching what was happening in the community around her. So as I saw this woman, I thought of my own family, my own, my own grandparents. And this elderly woman, as I was watching, she swept with a pride, and there was a pride of an elderly woman sweeping the front of her house, whether it was in Boston or Newton or any community across the country. But I was not in Boston. I wasn't in Newton. I wasn't in the United States. In fact, I was in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, which 6 years ago was the murder capital of the world. And the dirt road that our bus was bouncing along was in essence her front yard. And it cut through one of the city's bordos, or neighborhoods of extreme poverty. At this particular point in February 2019, President Trump was claiming that America was, quote, being invaded by this woman's neighbors, mothers, fathers, children, fleeing the hopelessness of violence, of murder, of poverty and corruption. And that these families, they were seeking the grace, the compassion, the protection of the United States asylum system, the United States immigration system. And what I learned during that trip is that for families across Central America, taking your chances with the cartels that dominated kind of the life of somebody who lives in Honduras, taking your chances that the US government will take your child once you get to the US-Mexico border, taking your chances that you may very well spend months, if not longer, in whether it's a detention facility or a camp along the US-Mexico border. Those chances are better than taking the chances with your child's life in the bordos of San Pedro Sula, Honduras, that I was traveling through at that point. Now, most of us in this, figurative room know of this woman's story in one way or another. We've read about the thousands of children separated from their parents. We've read about the more than 50,000 people who are currently living in camps on the Mexico side of the US border, waiting for their asylum case to be heard. We care about whether it's this woman, these families, this community deeply. For many of us, we base our stories, our work, our politics on this particular woman's story and the reality that she and her community live. And when the world begins to move again after COVID-19, our border and our asylum systems will face the stories and the realities of people just like this woman that I saw in Honduras, as people continue to come to the US to flee poverty, corruption, violence, and to seek a better opportunity in the US. But at this point in time, our nation's immigration system is not equipped to handle immigration moving forward. And I would argue that our immigration system has been ill-equipped to handle immigration over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So through this woman's story, we kind of begin to understand not just the system and its challenges, but we begin to understand the humanity and the human story behind the stresses that are put on the system. But I want to tell you actually about another woman as well. And this is also someone that we've heard about. And at best, we don't understand her or her family. At worst, we don't want to understand her or her family. And we met this other woman through a series of living room conversations that we put together over the course of 2018. And in rural and suburban communities across the country, we sat down with conservative and moderate faith leaders, business leaders, law enforcement leaders in rural and suburban communities. And in these conversations, what we wanted to try to understand is how these communities and these different perspectives were understanding immigration. We're seeing the debate playing out in their communities, but we wanted to make sure that we were talking to folks that had fears and anxieties, and that they could begin to describe to us how their communities were engaging in immigration or seeing immigration. So it was in one of these conversations that we met this woman of deep faith who, with her husband many years ago, planted an evangelical church that has become one of the largest on the West Coast, if not one of the largest in the country. And their socially conservative beliefs define their lives and their underlying values. But, this hasn't brought them to the place that, we may think. Because about 10 or 12 years ago, they realized that their community was changing and that there were more Latinos in their city, in their neighborhood, but also in their church. So in their desire to serve, they embarked on a new journey, a journey to welcome the stranger and ultimately to advocate for immigration reform. So in these conversations, whether it's this particular conversation or any of the other, 3 or 4 dozen that we've done, we always start the conversation asking people how they identify themselves. So just try to get people to talk about themselves and who they are, and let them define themselves kind of in their language. And this woman of faith told us, I'm very vanilla, very boring, small business owners, conservative, Republican, Christian. So in 2018, when this conversation took place, before then, now, she and her family and her community are among the 40% or so of Americans who would identify as evangelical Christian, approximately 80% of whom in 2016 voted for President Trump. I mean, look, evangelical Christians are the base of President Trump's election, much less re-election campaign. Let me be clear, I'm not being partisan here. I'm trying to be analytical and trying to convey a sense of who we are trying to talk to. So this woman is part of the evangelical community. And then in this living room conversation, we shifted to immigration and how communities and families are feeling about a changing America. And what I remember as I saw the video of the conversation is that her eyes, they began to well with tears. And that, this woman who is a person of deep faith, who with her husband have planted a church that has become a spiritual home to thousands upon thousands of people, she told us, I can't have that conversation with my brother or my dad about anything political like immigration, without that conversation becoming absolutely unbearable in seconds. And she closed her answer with, their reaction, her brother and her father's reaction, is driven out of a sense of fear that they're going to lose their security or their identity. And as I watched her speak, I thought of myself, not because I'm conservative, not because I'm a white evangelical Christian woman, but because I used to refer to someone like her as, quote, a crazy evangelical. And now I saw the pain in her face. I heard the anguish in her voice, and I realized that she was struggling to be a better person to immigrants who are part of their church community, but also immigrants who are caught up in this broader national immigration system. But that, and this is the surprising part, that she, like that Honduran grandmother that I would see, about a year later, sweeping the front of her home in Bordeaux in Honduras, the two of them were worried about losing their family. Right? That grandmother was worried about losing her family to violence, to poverty, to corruption, to an immigration journey. And this woman of faith was worried about losing her family because they had a different belief on how to engage and value and welcome immigrants into their communities. So these are two very different women who have very different realities. And one, like I said, representing Central Americans, fleeing awfulness, and the other, a conservative woman of faith who, if it wasn't for the approach that we're taking, I would not know, and frankly, I would not want to know. And I would probably want my politics to defeat her politics, which I think is indicative of the political environment that we live in writ large, but also how these issues like immigration play out. Because we could look to our institutions, to each other, to our respective faiths to find a common ground. Instead, too much, our politics overpowers our humanity, and we turn to our screen for comfort. But therein lies, I think, the opportunity, because we have an opportunity to tell the story of the family in Honduras to the conservative family in America, and to tell that story in a way that addresses their concerns, their anxieties, but presents them as opportunities and not as threats. Because I believe that our culture is defining our politics, so let's figure out ways that we can begin to change our culture. But in order to do so, we need to understand these fears that Americans have when it comes to immigration, and then we can talk about the solutions and the opportunities that come with. Over the course of those conversations, the course of the work that we've done as an organization, we believe that these fears kind of happen in three different ways. There's a fear around culture, security, and the economy. Culturally, the fear or the question that people have is that, is the question of, are immigrants, are they integrating or are they isolating? Are immigrants, are they just living in kind of amongst themselves, or are they learning English and integrating into society writ large? This is the fear that people have. And I'm not, I don't want to, kind of pass a judgment on it, but I just want to present our analysis of kind of what that fear is. In terms of security, the fear is, are immigrants or refugees, are they threats or protectors? Are they here to do harm, or are they here to protect Americans and American values? And then in terms of the economy, the fear is often, are immigrants and refugees, are they givers or takers? Are immigrants going to give back to the economy and create jobs, or take jobs and services? Sorry, Siri was talking to me. So culture, security, the economy. And these ultimately are the fears that we hear over and over again in communities across the country. And these are the fears in many ways that began to come out in the book as I was interviewing people. But in most cases, while these, I think, would, most folks on the left would say, okay, yes, these are what people are afraid of. I think in most cases, liberal America will ignore these fears. And I think what we've learned is that whether it's immigration or anything else, if we, whether we're liberal or conservative, are ignoring someone's fears, there's absolutely no chance for us to be able to have a conversation with them, begin to shift their assumptions, persuade them to think about these issues differently, and ultimately get somebody to act or behave differently. So we have to understand what the fears are. And then through the stories we tell, we have to be able to make the case that immigrants are protecting Americans and American values, such as serving in the armed services, or creating jobs across the country, serving in essential components of our economy as we go through the response and recovery to COVID-19, and ultimately are becoming Americans themselves, whether it's as learning the language in addition to the language they already speak, becoming U.S. citizens, running for office, or just as simple as joining the local PTA or community association. So the challenge here is that we're at a point in history where the speed and the clarity of what is broadcast to our phones has, I think, really shrunk our world. And one of the big reasons why I wanted to start with that story about the woman in Honduras is because I think for many Americans, they see the picture of that family from Honduras and they assume that that family is going to be their next door neighbor in a week, in 2 weeks, and that there's going to be all these threats that will come with that change. It doesn't mean that this particular family or individual is not compassionate. They don't want a child to be killed by a cartel. They don't want to see a family starve. So what we find is that, particularly among conservative churches, they'll take acts of grace where they'll do a mission to Central America, to Africa. They'll welcome a refugee into their home or into their community and their church. But that individual act, and through that individual act of grace, they will come to love the Maria or the Muhammad that they know. So there's that individual relationship that leads somebody to begin to think differently, and that starts to compete with what they're seeing on their phone. But what happens is that when somebody is still seeing those stories about international global migration, they remain afraid of the Maria or the Muhammad that they don't know, whether that is a neighborhood over, a city over, a state over, or in another country. So that's very much the tension of, okay, how do we yes, create these individual relationships and opportunities for someone who is native born to the US to get to know and get to understand and respect and care for an immigrant or a refugee to the US. But how do you extrapolate that particular experience to overcome the fear of what people don't know or can't see or can't feel? Because fear, we all know this. Fear is the most powerful of emotions. On one hand, it can drive a family north to seek protection in the US, whatever the risk, but it also drives voters and families in the US to pass new laws that build walls, that increase immigration enforcement, that, quite frankly, at this point in time, end immigration or asylum as we know it to the US. Because many voters in the US, because of these fears, they're told that they will lose their culture, their security, their jobs, if we as a country continue to welcome or immigrants into the US, whether for economic or for social reasons. But and this is the hard part of kind of where we are right now, and then I'll kind of pull back a little bit and talk about our work, is that fear is driving so much of our political debate right now around immigration. I would argue around a number of issues, and the frame is often that fear X, Y, or Z because it is a threat to your way of life. So as we enter what I would call a grueling stretch of the election, where the facts are that millions of Americans are out of work. Nearly 200,000 people have died because of COVID-19. 1 in 8 Americans are going hungry. And the finish line, that is November 3rd, the election, is actually a starting line to yet another phase of very unpredictable politics in the United States. How are we as a country going to navigate that the next 2 months, much less the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years? And how does immigration play into that? So before we talk a little bit more about kind of where we are now, where we're going, let me step back and give you a sense of how we as the forum have engaged in the work. So The forum itself has been around since 1982. Our mission is to advocate for the value of immigrants and immigration to the nation. I landed at the forum, and as Yvette said, in 2008. And in 2008, 9, and 10, we ran a strategy that was very focused on kind of progressive America. And what we realized at the end of 2010 is that we were ignoring, a huge swath of the United States. So beginning in 2011, we decided we were going to figure out the rest of the country. And we were going to figure out, okay, how do you have the conversation with a conservative or a moderate voter so that ultimately a Republican or even a moderate Democrat can say, okay, we need a fix to the immigration system. Because time and time again over the history of this debate, the legislative efforts have collapsed because we've been unable to generate the support necessary to bring Republicans and conservatives along on this path to a constructive approach to immigration. So in 2011, we looked at a few data sets. The first data set was the number of adults who identify as evangelical Christian. And what we found is that in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West, you have the highest number of adults who identify as evangelical Christian. Then we looked at the question of security. And in those same three regions, the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West, you have the highest density of state and local law enforcement. And then the final data set that we looked at was the growth in the foreign-born workforce or population in these regions as a proxy for a growing workforce, in essence, where you'd see economic growth. Same three regions had the fastest growth in the foreign-born workforce. People are moving to Georgia. There's a much faster growth in the Latino population in Georgia than there is in New York or the Northeast. So we're going to focus on these specific regions. So what we did beginning in 2011 is that we focused on the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West, on faith, law enforcement, business leaders, and created a coalition that's come to be known as Bibles, Badges, and Business for Immigration Reform. And keep in mind, I'm kind of jumping around on the timeline here. We came up with this strategy in 2011, faith, law enforcement, and business. And what we learned over time is that the value proposition that comes out of those particular constituencies matches up to the fears that we began to better understand over the course of time of culture, security, the economy. So over time, we've built out not just a set of relationships with pastors or police chiefs or CEOs, but more importantly, an understanding of how to communicate with these communities and how to communicate in a way that acknowledges people's fears, but again, presents those fears as opportunities. I'll give you one very, very recent example. So COVID-19 hits the United States in March of this year. Over the course of the spring of this year, we launched a campaign called All of Us. If you go to allofuscares.com, you can see the coalition that we built. And it's interesting because the coalition includes everybody from Unidos US, kind of a left-leaning Latino rights organization, to the Southern Baptist Convention. We've got the US Catholic Conference of Bishops Migration Committee, as well as the Dreamers. But this coalition across the political spectrum came around the idea of that all of us are contributing to the response and the recovery to COVID-19. And later in the summer, in fact, just in August, we did some polling, and we found that the messages that really led with values, in that the message being, if immigrants are contributing or standing shoulder to shoulder with native born to contribute to the response and recovery, we were seeing like a 15 to 25% shift, in a positive shift in support from conservatives for the idea that immigrants are a benefit to the country. So at a time when quite frankly, there's some forces in the country who are trying to scare the American public around the idea of immigration, the American public was seeing the contributions of immigrants as we're going through this this crisis of proportions that none of us have seen in our lifetimes. So what do you do with this, and how do you unpack it and really apply it to this moment? Over the weekend, there's a columnist for the Washington Post, Greg Sargent, who picked apart some polling from ABC News. It was a poll done by ABC and Ipsos. And he found that the polling suggested that voters may be linking uniting the country with keeping the country safe, but also drawing a link between dividing the country and making us less safe. So why does that apply to immigration? Because we have a president who is trying to, quite frankly, polarize the country based on race, on class, and insecurity. And while he's not talking about immigration as much as he has, as much these days, remember back in 2018 when that caravan was coming and we were all talking about, we're all being told about this invasion. That's when the national narrative, for the first time, really started to shift towards, in a very powerful way, towards the kind of the militarization of our immigration system. So let's go back to 2018. So in the fall of 2018, just before that midterm election, the administration announced an operation called Operation Faithful Patriot, and they deployed about 5,200 active duty US military to the US-Mexico border. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to Mayor Art Garino, who is with the mayor of Nogales, Arizona. Nogales is a town of about 22,000 right on the border. Right on the other side of the border is Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, a city of 200,000-300,000 people. Mayor Garino in January 2019 had no idea that the US military was about to install concertina or razor wire along the border wall going through his downtown. Now, what happened there was interesting because in 2018, the administration tried to capitalize on the fears that Americans had about immigration to try to move the election. But the American public said, you know what, this is not how we should be treating immigrants and refugees who are seeking protection in the US. So what happened is that I think in that case, the polarization, it didn't work. And in fact, I think that what has happened over time is that the American public has come to see immigrants and immigration in a very different way. So this all kind of comes back to the conversations that I had over the course of the research for the book, and the beginning to really deeply understand that immigration for the United States is not about politics and it's not about policy. It's not about just political power of who gets the most votes or about the best policy idea. It's ultimately, I think, or most importantly, about culture and values. So how do you shift the culture and therefore the values framework of conservative Americans to begin to see immigration in a different context? So I want to close with a story that's very recent, just really over the last month. And it's in some ways similar to the story that I began with, but I think it's timely in this context that we're all facing. So my colleague, Bree Stensrud, runs a campaign for us called Women of Welcome. And this campaign engages conservative and moderate evangelical women across the country. And Bree told me about Carla. Carla is a woman in her late 50s who lives about an hour outside of Dallas. In essence, she is the conservative suburban woman that all the political pundits are all talking about. And Carla told Bree that she would describe herself, again, kind of identifying herself as, quote, a complacent Christian, content with just going to heaven, who, when it came to immigration, what she told Bree was that she didn't know a lot about it until she learned about this campaign. But up to that point, what she believed is that what you think about immigration is what you see on your television. So as Carla learned more about immigrants, immigration, about refugees through webinars, through films that were designed to help her see these issues through a Christian or evangelical prism, she began to realize that she was, quote, a minority within her family and friends since her heart has changed. And she told Bree, I feel alone a lot of the time. But Carla, in spite of feeling alone, still felt strongly enough based on what she was learning and what was being provided to her through her cultural framework that she decided to visit the camps of immigrants and refugees in Matamoros, Mexico. And this is one of the largest camps of migrants, by and large, from Central America who are waiting for their asylum hearings in the US. And these days, they're pretty much stuck there until COVID-19 recedes. So when she goes to the camps and she tells Bree, when you realize these families are trying to survive, that they're fleeing violence, it changes how you see them. So now, Carla tells Bree, her mother and her daughters are starting to understand. And her husband, a Trump supporter, is supportive of what she is learning and doing, but, Carla tells Bree, he's just not sure how to reconcile the issue of immigration and what he's seeing and what he's learning from his wife with the support of the Trump administration. Which brings me to a larger point, and that point is that reconciliation, whether it's personal or systemic or political, it doesn't come without realizing the dignity of the other. I just recently read a book by Michael Rosen, Dignity, Its History and Meaning, and he illustrates, excuse me, dignity in three ways. The idea of dignity as status, the idea of dignity as an inherent value, and the idea of dignity as behavior, character, or bearing that is dignified. I would argue that through family separations, border walls with razor wire, and now a racialization of the country, if not of immigration, Trump would like us to see immigrants as people without dignity, without humanity. And that immigrants and refugees, and this, let me be clear, has preceded Trump. He is just the latest manifestation of this. This has preceded him. That immigrants and the other are a threat to a way of life. So in my conversation with Mayor Guarino, I asked him how the razor wire on the fence in Nogales, and Nogales has had fencing since 1910. I asked him how it's changed his community. And he said that it breaks his heart when he talks to the abuelitos, the grandparents in the community, and they point to the fence and they point to the wire, more importantly, and they say, this is not my Nogales. Which, just like that Honduran grandmother and her similarity of her story to the woman of faith, the Nogales, the grandparent in Nogales, has a similar story or reaction as Carla. Because Carla tells Bree, I love America. But she tells Bree, we've allowed ourselves to be divided. We have let politics to become a part of our communities and our church. And she says, I didn't see that before, and now I do, and it breaks my heart. So my point here is that when it comes to immigration, fears are often presented as threats, cultural threats, demographic threats, economic threats. But there's an opportunity here to present them as opportunities for change. And I firmly believe that in order to realize that systemic change, that yes, we have to meet people where they are. We have to go through those difficult conversations. We have to understand what's the language and the framework through which they understand and see immigration. They assume things about immigration. We have to be patient, and we have to learn new things ourselves. Because ultimately, while we're going to meet somebody where they are, we're not going to leave them there. And I would close with that of the massive challenges that our country is going to face moving forward, yes, immigration is one of them. And like I said at the beginning, I am honored and privileged to work on this issue. But there's going to be a ton of challenges. And I think in the context of your education, what you're learning, I think one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face as a country is restoration of the public's trust in public health, in prevention, in vaccines, in essence, a common good. And communicating with people who do not trust your message through facts or figures or spreadsheets requires a different approach. We can't be asking somebody who is distrustful to believe our facts or our science if we don't understand the cultural framework through which that mistrust is even happening. So my question would be, the question that we grapple with in immigration is that what are the values-based messages that resonate with our target audience's culture? Who are the people, who are the messengers that they will trust? It is more times than not, the pastor, the police chief, that small business owner. Because I think I just have to think that in between the tribalism of cable news, underneath the grenades that are lobbed across our Twitter or our Facebook feeds, Americans believe that they are better than what they see on their screens, that they know their fears of each other are creating chaos and division. But at this point in time, too many people feel like that they have nowhere to go. So for us at the National Immigration Forum, we believe that this is our opportunity to provide people a place to go. Because that if we listen to them and they listen to us, and if we listen to each other, we may find common cause and thus political alliances, and thus a way ultimately to fix our nation's immigration system so that we can be both a nation of grace and a nation of laws. And that, I think that as tough as this time may be, as controversial as the issues are that we all care about, immigration among them, that this is our opportunity to work together to build an America that is just, an America that is good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. That's a lot, and I just want to start with some questions that I have, and then we'll bring in people from the audience. So please enter your questions through the Q&A. So overall, I'm struck by the tone of hope that's in your book. And of course, this book was originally written in the lead up to the election in 2016 and published soon after. Now, 4 years later, do you still really feel that hope? And
yeah, I mean, look, it's very easy, and it's also very important for us to kind of fall into those moments of despair and anger and be honest about them. But I just, that story that I tell of Carla, that story is from the last month. And she's not the only person like that we're working with. And, from my perch now, I am multiple degrees removed from the work. And I just think that if we lose that sense of hope, if we lose that sense of, if we lose that desire to kind of reach out and have that conversation and create the vehicles and the strategies and the organizations that can do that, then yeah, it does become pretty hopeless pretty quick. So yeah, I remain hopeful because I just think that there are a lot of people looking for a different place to go on this. So
following up on that, your Bibles, Badges, and Business sort of triad, there's these, of course, are not the usual partners within public health, the way we think about public health and advocacy often. So obviously, how do we build those connections, especially given this time where those three things, not just around immigration, but around other cultural and social upheaval right now, seem to be viewed as adversaries? How do we advise to go forward?
So a lot of times, there's an assumption that we have to kind of do it all on our own, right? Mm-hmm. That it's a matter of me sitting down with you to have this conversation, and we're both going to get really angry, we're going to yell at each other, and then we're going to hug, and we're going to get along, and it'll be all fine. Yes, we live in a reality show, but that's not the reality show that we live in. I think that at the community level, at the city level, there are institutions that can help us do this. I think that there is some amazing interfaith work that's happening across the country. I think that I was talking to a law professor from Vanderbilt a few weeks ago, and she was talking about how she's not just taking her students to the border, but how she's also making sure that her students are engaging with organizations that kind of will maybe look at this from a different perspective. So I think there are a lot of institutions already in place that can help us do this, and that we just have to find that institution that we feel comfortable with, but also that institution feels comfortable kind of creating these types of strategies and executing them.
Great. And, and another thing that really struck me as you were talking about your experiences in these individuals is, immigration has a long history in the US. I don't know how familiar we get once we sort of move beyond it. So, my father was an immigrant to this country, and he rarely spoke about his experiences. And so it seemed like it was this very easy, beautiful process. And you often hear in the arguments, often against immigration, is that I went through X, therefore the process needs to be this particular way. Has this type of sort of disconnect, or has there always been this argument with immigration that it's almost like a rolling up the welcome mat once someone is here?
So we have a podcast. It's called Only in America, and I think back in July and August we did this series, and we framed the series as "How Did We Get Here?" And we interviewed 4 different folks who were incredibly helpful and kind of very quickly kind of summarizing this journey of this immigration journey, right? We started with the author Jialin Yang, and she just wrote a book called A Mighty Irreversible Tide. And she more or less follows the history of kind of immigration politics between the 1920s and 1965. And, in 1924 is the first time we really tried to put up some serious roadblocks to immigration. And that was kind of a trend that carried on for a good 40, 45 years and that was the law that instituted really, in essence, racial quotas through our immigration system. She gets us to 1965 and the Immigration Nationality Act, which eliminated the quotas, created this family immigration system. But then we talked to Charles Kamasaki, who was a key player in the 1986 legislation, and then Doris Meisner, who ran immigration services for President Clinton. So my point is that over the last 100 years, we've gone through a lot of peaks and valleys around immigration. I could probably make a pretty good argument that right now we're living through a period that feels like the 1920s in terms of the know-nothings and kind of the ugliness of the debate. And yes, there's always been this, this tension within the country of, okay, I'm in, there shouldn't be anybody else. And, in fact, Doris Meisner told me in the book, to paraphrase, Americans, they cherish immigration in the hindsight, but not so much in the present. So the challenge here is that, how do you learn from history, but how do you apply those lessons to the future?
Yeah. And I'd say perhaps just looking at a comment that's come in, sort of following that, what is the role of assimilation? And is that something that is one truly achievable, and would, is that necessary? Is that required for there to be consensus around immigration? And how has assimilation shaped these arguments for immigration?
That's a great question. I think that, when you look at the polling over time, one of the most frustrating things for folks who have concerns about immigration, to shorthand it or to be glib, is to press 1 for English. And this feeling like, okay, the English language and the English quote culture is being lost by immigration. But obviously that's just an oversimplification of something that's much more complicated. And I think it's changed over time as well. I think that the current generation who's growing up in the US, they're much more comfortable with multiple languages, multiple cultures. I mean, that's how kids these days grow up. That's how many of us and the students today grew up. It's not necessarily how our parents or our grandparents grew up if they were from the US. So, I think we have to understand kind of how that's changing in terms of public understanding. But I also think we have to realize that for a lot of immigrants, they want to learn English because they see English or kind of integration into society as their pathway to better opportunities.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Just sort of turning back to some of what you were talking about earlier about fear, and really how we think about, fear that perhaps the left may ignore about culture, security, and economy. But also there are fears on the side of immigrants and those who advocate for them. And how do those, this fear of violence and families being torn apart, how does this come into the conversation? Does this get elevated as well in that back and forth dialogue?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do a lot of work with law enforcement across the country. We built out a task force of about 130 police chiefs and sheriffs across the country. And it's been really interesting because their approach to immigration is not, work visas or family reunification. It's about community safety. And what we find is that for a law enforcement official and or somebody from the community to say, you know what, I want to live in a safe community just like anybody else. And that means that I want to be protected from crimes that are committed by somebody outside of my community or somebody within my community. It really helps folks, again, who have struggles and fears about the issue at large say, okay, those are the same fears that I have. And, and oftentimes it's kind of oversimplified these days as kind of a sanctuary city or not. Right. And, what we talk about is that I'll say, I don't want to live in a sanctuary city. I want to live in a safe city. And a safe city is a city where law enforcement are going to serve and protect every single person, regardless of immigration status. And that means that local law enforcement should not be in the business of enforcing immigration law, which in essence is the same thing as, quote, the politicized term of sanctuary city, but it's a much smarter approach to law enforcement. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that we have to always think about ways that we are making, helping people understand that just because somebody wasn't born in the United States doesn't mean that they don't have the same aspirations or fears that somebody who's been here for generations have.
Yeah. So when it comes again to the how, I don't know, the argument gets framed, or we try to bridge these divides, it almost seems like, there's fear on both sides. So does it really end up with who has the louder microphone or megaphone that, sort of runs with the message of fear and, ways to try to counter that or bring it down? I'm not sure if I'm even asking a question here, but that just sort of seems to be our struggle, our main part of it.
Yeah. And I think this also plays out in the public health sphere, where you just have parallel media universes, right? You've got the New York Times over here and you've got Fox News over there. And they say very, very opposite things, whether, kind of almost regardless of what the issue is. And, what oftentimes I'll tell, our donors are thrilled when our work will show up in the New York Times. I'm actually much happier when our work shows up in Christianity Today, because that's a media publication that is speaking to this audience who is trying to think about, trying to learn about, trying to understand the issue of immigration in a different way. So I just think we have to try to understand where people are getting their information and how that is kind of shaping their perception.
So I'm looking at another question here, and it brings me to a larger question. So this individual's question is, what if it's not the fear, but it's the racist thought processes that hinder the political spectrum to come together on the issue of immigration? So, as you've been presenting, it's very clear that the fault lines in immigration are very similar to the fault lines around race that we have in this country. Is that also driven by fear, or is that?
Yeah, so it's really, that's just an important question. Look, we created this strategy, we've driven this strategy using a language of culture as one of the fears and not race, in a very, very intentional way. Because, I think that the folks that we're trying to engage and move, I just know that if we walk into that room, into that conversation, either directly or through our communications, even giving a sense that there's their belief on their fears around immigration are based on racism, that's a much harder conversation to have. And so now we as an organization are really trying to understand, okay, how do we continue to do our work, but do a better job of connecting the issues of racial justice with immigration, and being very cognizant in our language and our approach, because, I think that for a lot of people, the fears are a combination of race and class. And you don't have to peel back many layers to go from race and class to economy, security, culture. So be honest with you, we struggle with it, and but I do know that for a lot of people that we know, and that have who've gone on to become very, very important allies for us, with us, we would not have been able to have that partnership if we had said, okay, you're afraid of immigration because of racism. And that's, it's important, but I think sometimes that simplifies things.
Thank you. There's another question, which I think comes back to the Bible's badges and business, and particularly the badges part. What do you make of the defund the police campaign currently gaining traction? It's a different strategy for seeking progressive policy change. Could it also be a different way of fostering dialogue, or some of the reaction again to defunding the police, that statement, will that be an impediment?
So I think that, and this, in the immigration space, the parallel is abolish ICE. Defund the police, abolish ICE. That's kind of the message that will come from some parts of the movement. Our take on this is that, law enforcement needs to be held accountable, right? And, the law enforcement officials that we work with, some of them are Republicans, some of them are Democrats, some of them are big cities, some of them are small town. They want to make sure that, they can do their job and their officers are held accountable. They themselves are held accountable. So I'm not going to say that defund police or abolish ICE, is the right or the wrong approach. It's part of the movement. It's part of kind of the broader conversation. But ultimately, we need to make sure that in the immigration context, we have enforcement policies, laws and policies on the books that are holding people to account for their actions, that are treating immigrants humanely and fairly, and that ultimately not just our nation is secure, but our nation's values are upheld. And there's a way to have that conversation. I think there's a lot of work that can be done in terms of improving not just local law enforcement practices to be held more accountable, but also in the context of immigration enforcement.
Thank you. So another question, and thank you all for submitting your questions. It comes again to that sort of discussion we touched on earlier about meeting people kind of on the other side. How will we be able to explain different viewpoints to those who don't agree with us? And I think essentially this person is getting to the question of how do we get to listen to each other? If there's someone who will not listen, do we just move on, or do we continue to try? And in your work, how have you dealt and made that distinction of where you should put your effort?
Look, there's some people who are not going to change their mind, right? And so I'll tell you a story of, so we were moderating I was moderating one of these conversations, right? These living room conversations that I mentioned. And it was in Corpus Christi, Texas, which, if you haven't been to Corpus, it's an interesting city. It's kind of a small to mid-sized city right on the Gulf. Very conservative, but also very diverse. Large Hispanic population, but large number of them are actually are native born. So there's not a large kind of per se immigrant population, but it's very politically conservative. Our organizers done a really great job of kind of building this room, because they'd literally gone to like the Republican County Commissioners event the night before and kind of track people down and say, hey, why don't you come? So we had an interesting room of, I would say about 15 people, racially representative of the city. We had Hispanic, white, African American, politically very diverse. But before we get started, we're kind of, chit-chatting, coffee and donuts. And I talked to like this elderly white man, let's just say he's like in his 60s. And he was not pro-immigrant by any means, right? He wanted to be there because he wanted to be a part of the conversation. He knew somebody else who was there, but I could tell really quickly. He's like, okay, this guy he's gonna bring some tension to this conversation. So we go through this conversation. Remember, it's like identities, going into these fears, etc. And what I made a point of doing is I was moderating it, because moderating these conversations, we weren't trying to explain the issues. We weren't answering questions, but I would always kind of like pull them into the conversation. And sometimes he would be like, we got to build a wall, we got to deport people. So then at the end of the conversation, I kind of left the script a little bit. And I said, okay, put yourself in my shoes. What is the way that we should be talking about immigration in order to help the American public understand that we need immigration reform? And this gentleman, again, who presented initially as, very like in a very kind of a negative and almost, I don't want to say confrontational, but there was an edge to him. He gave me the best message. He said, I think we need to have an immigration system that's tough but fair. Okay, I can work with that, right? There's a lot of space to work with in talking about an immigration system that's tough but fair. And I just know, like, if that was an hour and a half conversation, right? So you can't always do that. But I just knew, like, if I could pull him into that conversation and he felt like he was being heard, then there's a pretty good chance we could really kind of engage in a thoughtful way. So my point here is that, when we're talking with folks who we may not agree with, the trick is not to talk. The trick is just to ask questions and let other people talk. And if you know who you're talking to ahead of time, try to read what they read. Try to use some of their language so that they really feel heard. And the trick here is not in a conversation, is just not to talk.
That's actually a good a good listening skill to learn. Do you ever encounter people that may agree with you on immigration issues, but saw immigration as inferior to other issues? So maybe it's similar to what we were talking about a little earlier about, kind of squaring race and other things, but.
Yep. Yeah, so over time, and I think like we're in a moment in time where this may not apply, but maybe a different version of it. So let's just say up till the beginning of 2020, for conservatives, when you look at the polling, immigration was always a top issue in the top 5. Mm-hmm. And that's quite frankly why you had very conservative Republicans always talking about immigration, because they knew that it's a top priority for their audience, and it led to a level of voter mobilization against immigration. Among the left, immigration would always be kind of like number 10, number 12, somewhere down there. So you had this really, as an advocate, you had a really kind of interesting challenge, right? You wanted to kind of reduce the temperature among opponents. You wanted to increase the temperature among supporters. But then on the left, people would say, well, climate, jobs, healthcare, all these other issues are 10 times more important. So, as an immigration advocate, it's like, that's when I feel a little less hopeful to go to here. But, I think one of the things that's happening is that even as kind of the two sides will kind of oscillate, there's a growing sense of kind of the independent of the moderate voter who is getting increasingly tired of the polarization, who's seeing immigration as a consensus issue that Congress needs to address.
Yeah. So, here's an interesting question, and I'm just going to take it in the spirit that it's being, completely on its face honest. Should we have completely open borders?
No.
Mhm.
I think that borders, I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. Borders are the way that they're part of our identity. Because a border could be the US-Mexico border. It could also be the border between Roxbury and the South End, Roxbury and Dorchester. So I think that we as a country, as a world, are always going to have borders because they're always going to be a function of the way that we, as the human race, construct society. So I think that we're always going to have, we're always going to need borders, but we need to have borders that are cognizant of the fact that people move. It is one of the most natural things that we do. And in fact, in the book, I talked to Archbishop Wensky from South Florida, and he really kind of blew my mind in this conversation where he talked about kind of the idea of the natural law of kind of the movement of people and the migration of people, which, for a conservative Catholic, they apply to a range of issues, not just migration, obviously. So my point is here is, as I ramble a little bit, yes, we have borders. We're always going to have borders. How do we make sure that our borders are more cognizant of the reality that we as people and we as countries face?
Well, thank you. There's another question here that, and it's really about what are some of the things that immigrants themselves can do in advocating for their rights and bridging some of these divides? How can they become active?
Well, I mean, I should have said this earlier on. I apologize, but our approach in terms of engaging kind of the center and the center right is ineffective, a failure without the active and the vibrant leadership coming from the immigrant community. I think that what has happened over the last 10 years is that the leadership of the immigrant community has really emerged in such a powerful way. And I think that the most important thing that the immigrant community can do is always be generous with their story. And that places a lot of pressure on people, which is probably not fair. But by sharing one story, you help other people understand, okay, that Maria or that Mohammed, I may not know them, but I know somebody who's just like them. And that's just really important.
Well, thank you. I apologize for any barking that's in the background here.
No problem. You didn't hear my dog. You didn't hear my dog chewing on our squeaky toy.
Okay, maybe they're communicating to each other right now, right?
Wrap it up. Wrap it up.
Right. Yeah. So following up from another questioner, how do we, as people who advocate for immigrants, reach people who are located far away from any immigrant populations? And to that question, I will just ask, I mean, I know that there remain some very isolated places, but you have named some places that one would not have thought would have a presence of individuals from other countries. So are there really, how isolated are some people to immigration? Yeah. And then how do we reach those individuals?
So the thing about the country is that, immigrants 10 years ago, 15 years ago, yes, by and large in urban areas. Mm-hmm. Now, some of the fastest growth among the foreign-born population is in the Midwest. I've spent some time in a small town in Iowa called Storm Lake, Iowa. It's about 14,000 people. It is one of the few towns in Iowa that's growing, and it's only growing because of immigration. Wow. And Steve King, the terrible anti-immigrant congressman, he represents Storm Lake. right? Or represented. So he's going to be out of office. So I do think that the country, as is becoming more diverse, is not just becoming diverse in the cities, it's becoming diverse everywhere, which is a challenge and an opportunity. So I think that in order to reach folks who, so one question was how isolated. I think that sense of isolation is less and less. But since it is less and less, I think the tension is can be greater and greater. Right. So that backlash is that all of a sudden somebody's not just reading about an immigrant family is moving in down the street, and that's can't avoid that. So I think that how do we find the organizations and the vehicles to tell stories that resonate with these communities? How do you support organizations or research projects that are taking place in rural or suburban areas? I think that so much of the way that the public is kind of understanding these issues is through the media or the communications that they receive.
Well, so I have a last question, and I want to ask you to sort of share with our students now, in particular in the SPH community, how do we move forward? So I'll come back again to the theme of hope in your book, and how do we harness that sense of hope and continue to move forward with this. We don't know what November will bring, but I think regardless, there's going to be a lot of difficulty moving things through politically. And how do we move forward and keep doing the good work?
I've had a lot of conversations, I would just say over the last couple of weeks, with friends who are kind of in the political space, right? As advocates, as playing one role, and everybody's like, if we lose this election, I'm moving to Canada, right? Or things are gonna get really bad. And it hit me last night. It's like, yes, things will be really bad, but I know for myself, chances are I'll still have a job. Chances are I will still be able to, put food on the table, that I'll still be able to contribute in some way to the country and to making the country better. So I guess what I'm saying here is that whether or not I am hopeful in that moment, I think that as practitioners of public health, we have taken on a responsibility for the public and to care about the public and to work towards the public good and to do everything in our power, as expansive as it may be or as limited as it may be, to improve the common good. And that, sometimes it's trite to say that, we have to believe in the idea of America because we're led to believe that the idea of America is only in a politician or some elected figure. But to me, the idea of America is, it's in Carla, who is really struggling to think about this issue in a very different way and cares about immigrants and immigration in a way that is leading to her ostracization from her family. Yeah. That's the idea of America. And that's what's going to give me hope moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you. There was one thing I wanted to clarify. Earlier, you were talking about the militarization of the immigration system and around Nogales. You'd mentioned an organization that was working there at the U.S.-Mexican border, I believe. And there was a question, someone had missed what that was.
Organization Nogales. I think I just mentioned Mayor Guarino, who is the mayor of Nogales.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to bring that up to someone. Sure. But Ali, I really, really want to thank you for your time today and for your book and for the work that you're doing. Are there ways that students could get involved at all with your organization? We don't have to answer that right now, but is this something, as this unfolds as a real public health mission for some students, that they can come together with this? But I appreciate your time, and I'm very proud to have you among our alumni, and really appreciate this afternoon. So
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
No problem. Sandro?
I really just want to echo what Yvette said. I always learn from you, and I respect immensely the work you're doing. I think it's always been important, and it goes without saying it's more important now than ever. So really, on behalf of the school, thank you for representing us so well as a school. And on behalf of the country and the world, thank you for everything you're doing, and for giving us your time on a day like this. I loved your book when I first read it, when it first came out, and I was delighted that Yvette and the group chose it for our SPA trees, and that our students got to read it as well. So Ali, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for the hard work you'll be doing the next couple of months and beyond. And Yvette,
thank you.
Thank you for arranging this. Everybody, have a great evening.